viewpoint. It makes a lot of sense in the 1960s or so when questions about marriage and free love change when you have birth control, and now there's a different biological relationship between marriage and childbearing and the role of family and kinship networks and all that to support children. But you don't have that in the 1840s, 1850s. A woman who has a child out of wedlock is much more vulnerable than they would be a century later. Yet these ideas are still percolating in a way when there's this anthropological current against it. So what do you think is going on?
Yes, it's really interesting. So in other words, they wanted to abolish traditional marriage, but we still, the question of traditional marriage and its value is still very much in question today. And it's that way with a lot of the issues that were on the table, I think. So free lovers, you're right, that the marriage relation was fundamentally different than the marriage relation that we know now, in part because of the issue of birth control. And part of what free lovers were calling for was what they called voluntary motherhood. And this had different meanings at different moments and when it was used by different people. Some people were talking about birth control, but other people were just talking about marital rape, basically. They had to kind of make the case that wives should be able to be sexually unavailable if they wanted to be, because there was that sex was accompanied always with the idea of reproduction and children, because as you say, it was, this was a time, it was a different time in terms of the availability of even information about conception and birth control. And so they were making the argument, in essence, it was a feminist movement. They thought that the institution of marriage, they had kind of pointed to it as the symbolic and the real site of women's subordination. And they felt that until that most kind of tenacious private form of inequality was a thing of the past, that really any talk of even about women's public empowerment would be hamstrung, because ultimately, women in this fundamental aspect of life played this completely subordinate role. And again, this is a moment where we have coverture, meaning that, women essentially gave up their legal identity and rights in marriage. And so it was a different moment in that sense. And yet, I think, you look around and you still see quite a bit of commentary and writing about this question of private inequality in women's lives and what role that plays what role it plays in the overall picture of women's ability to flourish in public.
Well, I guess here's my question to tie in these different characters together. It seems like a lot of them were on, quote unquote, the wrong side of history, which maybe is why we don't know about them as much today, because they weren't supporting popular movements that took hold, or like we said earlier, they might have been utopianists that are just remembered today because they're thought of as strange or kooky. But I do like to look at history as a laboratory of human experience. I think a lot of people, whether they realize it or not, they have a Whig theory of history that says we stand where we are because the good people in history were coming to the moment that we're at now, and those who support it were the good people, and those who weren't were the bad people. That's true in some cases. Slavery's bad. The Nazis are bad. We can all support that. But then there's a lot of shades of gray within that. So for many of these figures who are on, quote unquote, the wrong side of history that I think you look at today, what do you think their stories tell us? And what is it that you would hope to be understood from your book?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think it's a complex one, because this question of which of these movements succeeded and which ones failed is one that I've tried to grapple with in the book, and one that is not easy to answer, because historians who you were talking earlier about the utopian communities, and utopianism is interesting to me in this book, specifically about these socialist experiments that we call utopian because Marx and Engels called them utopian. But utopianism, first of all, a lot of the movements that were ultimately successful, like women's suffrage or emancipation, these goals were called utopian. It was believed that they could never be accomplished. It was just too completely out of sync with what normal people believed. And those things, in fact, they seem to us now like common sense or just like simple reforms. And so there was that the impossible was proven by these movements in several instances. But I also think about utopianism just in terms of that utopianism is that it's kind of a necessary orientation for doing any kind of social justice work, and that being able to or being willing to expose oneself to failure is part of the task that sets these people apart from just kind of well-meaning people who stand by. I mean, the people in this book were actually willing to try to do something that probably wasn't going to work. And so when you think about something like Brook Farm, commentators at the time, and then certainly historians now too, it's hard not to just repeat the common sense conclusion that it failed, right? Because it went bankrupt and it closed. And so I've tried to re-examine those moments about, really what did Brook Farm or an experiment like Brook Farm, what did it accomplish, if anything, and what did these people accomplish without creating the kind of simple narrative of progress that you're describing, because I think that we see that the progress, if these movements certainly did accomplish an amazing amount, but that the progress that they made was not simple, and that we still are fighting many of the same battles, and that's where the utopianism comes in, is that this kind of work is never done.
Yeah, history is not so tidy. It doesn't go through one single current, but there are lots of eddies and places where the river branches off into these interesting little streams like you've chronicled. So, thank you for sharing all this and showing how complicated history can be, but help us to understand our own story. So your book is American Radicals, How 19th Century Protest Shaped the Nation. Holly, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that wraps up our exploration of the past for this episode. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Todd Warren, Jake Harrington, Beverly Engel, Bill Ivey, Joyce Norman, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books: Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.